we need to be doing things in new ways. So it isn't about whether this knowledge or this worldview is the right one or whether another one is, but rather this is where we are at this point in time. So if we're looking at the health of the ocean or whether or not we should create a new mine somewhere, how we're going to do those kind of things as a society, then how do we bring together the values and the governance systems, the decision-making systems, so that as we move forward, we're doing so in a good way, so that the potential of all people is respected, and that we're looking out for everyone's best interest.
This is going to be a great podcast. I'm really looking forward to it and want to welcome you, Sylvia, to the Co-Management Commons podcast. And every time you and I talk, I'm always left thinking more deeply and wondering what you must be thinking, because you keep a lot of stuff inside sometimes. But I know the wheels are turning, and I'm really expecting to be thinking a lot more deeply after our conversation today as well. But maybe we could just start by introducing yourself to our listeners and let people know more about who Dr. Sylvia Moore is and the person behind the academic CV.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate the invitation. So I'm a counseling therapist. I'm also an educator and an associate professor at Memorial University School of Arctic and Subarctic Studies here in Labrador, which is where I am today. I'm from Gesbewick, which is also known as Southwest Nova Scotia, and my extended family is Mi'kmaq. I live and work here. I've been here about 10 years. And previous to that, I lived in various other places across the country.
And I should clarify for people, you are not my counselor, so I would never subject you to that. But the topics that we always talk about are really interesting and about different worldviews and things of that sort. But yeah, when you say you've been across the country, what are some of the different locations and people that you've had the chance to work with?
Mm-hmm. Yes, well, I'm very grateful for having been able to travel across Canada and live in so many places. But a number of those have been in Northern and Indigenous communities, which I think is important for our conversation today. So I've lived and worked on the traditional territory of the Chief Dry Geese in the Dene region of Yellowknife, the Black Lake Dene First Nation, which is in northern Saskatchewan, just on Lake Athabasca. The New Chalmouth on the west coast of Vancouver Island, Inuit communities in Nunavut, of course, the homelands here in Labrador of the Inuit and the Innu, and the Mi'kmaq in Nova Scotia. But I just want to add and stress that I don't speak for any of these groups and I don't represent them in any way, but I'm continuing to learn from my past and current experiences with all of these different Indigenous groups, and I'm very grateful for it.
Yeah, just in that short summary of all of the places you've been, I think it's a great reason for people to reflect on why the word Indigenous by itself sometimes is just not specific enough. And across all of the different regions and the people that you've worked with, you must have encountered clearly a lot of different worldviews and ways of looking at things. And what are some of your reflections so far in your work when it comes from the diversity of worldviews that you've been immersed in?
For sure. I think one of the most important things to learn is that the Indigenous people in any particular place are people who lived there for a very, very long time, most say since time immemorial, and that they've adapted ways of understanding the world, ways of living in that environment, on that landscape, with those life forms, whatever forms of animals and plants and weather conditions and all of those kind of things. And what they know and how they live is so important to just listen to them talk about that, to learn from them, my practice is always go to new places and simply to listen and to learn from the people there, because they know in ways that I'll never know and understand. They have many, many, many generations of knowledge that they share and live by, and that it's important to learn from them. And what's happening on the west coast of Vancouver Island is not the same as what's happening on the Arctic Ocean, and it's not the same as what's happening here in Labrador or in Southwest Nova Scotia, and that it's all different, and that we use that term Indigenous, which sometimes makes us think that they're the same, but these groups and these knowledge systems and ways of living in the world are not the same. But there are similarities, and that, of course, is very important, and that those similarities are different than Eurocentric or Western worldviews.
When you say worldviews, can we unpack that a little bit for people? It may be self-explanatory or it may not be. I'm not sure. But how would you articulate what our respective worldviews are?
Well, the way I've come to understand it is through my own life experiences, through reading, talking to elders and scholars. And so I can share with you my understanding, which may be different than other people's. So for me, a worldview it's a framework of understanding the world. And so all of us, I believe, have some sort of framework that we're not necessarily aware of, that we learn in whatever society and family we grow up in. And we pick up these things and we understand and accept them as that's the way that the world is. We have particular practices or ways of doing things and ways of thinking about things, even more importantly. And that these can be sort of grouped into our worldviews, so there's commonalities across them. So it's a framework for understanding the world, whether we're conscious or aware of it or not, or to what degree we may be aware of it. And that those worldviews tend to be very different between Indigenous peoples who live in place close to the earth and have lived in these places and existed for millennia, and how that's different than a worldview, so very general terms, from Eurocentric or Western colonial views of the world.
When I reflect on that, I know one of the things that we wanted to talk about today was this whole concept of decolonizing our minds. And I'd like to explore that a little bit more and what that actually means. And is that something that everybody can do, or is that something that only refers to an Indigenous mind? What does it mean to decolonize our minds?
Well, Blackfoot scholar Leroy Littlebear, he says that no one has a pure worldview that's 100% Indigenous or Eurocentric, but rather everybody has an integrated mind that fluctuates back and forth, what he refers to as an ambidextrous consciousness. So just start with that to say there aren't firm delineations here between one and the other. But when I think of decolonizing our minds, which I've spent a lot of time thinking about, practicing, working on, and writing about, particularly in the context of K-12 education, is that we're all immersed in a very colonial society, that through the process of colonization, those Eurocentric kinds of ways of being, attitude, practices, lifestyles, and beliefs about the world have come into what we refer to as North America, and it's touched every one of our lives. And we tend not to be very aware of it. These tend to be ways of thinking about the world that we don't necessarily always question in any way. So for me, decolonizing our minds means that we become conscious of and that we're attuned to the way of life that colonialism and the power structures that are held within colonial social structures impact our lives and the way that we think about the world and the way that we go about doing things. So in many ways, it's a sort of default thinking pattern that we're not always aware of. And I think that it affects us certainly preschool, as I said before, small children growing up in families and cultures, they're just learning. But in school, we very much reinforce a certain way of understanding and knowing the world. And it just goes from there in terms of the influence that these cognitive frameworks have on us. So much of it is intentional and much of it is unintentional. But to unpack that, to question why things are the way they are, why we think about things in a certain way, how we go about things, and not necessarily just talking about driving our cars or what we have for breakfast, but in fact, those things are there as well. It's everything we do, how we make decisions, how we give into or expect that 5-year-old children all start school, that when the government makes a law, that's what the law is. It's just throughout. And for Indigenous peoples whose ancestors have been colonized and who for generations have been influenced and brought into mainstream society, then for them it's even more important to say, what is my Indigenous ways of knowing and doing? Where are the values and the knowledges that my ancestors had? How can we practice and put into our lifestyles our own ways, our own cultural ways of being in this world? And so Marie Batiste talks about the way that people struggle with cognitive imperialism, again, mostly through the school system, but the way that we're influenced to think about ways of knowing, doing, and being that are very much based on Eurocentric views of the world.
Yeah, and this whole topic is so interesting to me in a co-management context, because when you bring different groups of people to a table that have to reach consensus, and they're appointed by different levels of government, and some people will have an Indigenous worldview, some others certainly won't, and everybody has been educated in different disciplines and comes from different walks of life, I'll say. And a lot of the conflict that's been written about in co-management, to me, often seems to be captured in the fact that there's different worldviews that people aren't getting past. And a lot of times that manifests itself in debates about Indigenous science versus Western science. But I think in the process of building good co-management relationships, it's more nuanced than just saying we're working with two different knowledge systems. And one of the things that I'm curious about is, how do we get people to show up to these spaces, acknowledging and realizing that they all have different worldviews, but also come with a willingness, I guess I could say, to park our own worldviews at times to try to understand where everybody is coming from. And I think that goes for everybody that's engaged in these co-management conversations. But any thoughts on how to get people to show up with that consciousness that we're all coming from a different place so we can start to work through some of these things?
That's a really good question, because it's always about change to some degree, and it's always about unpacking and maybe even interrogating our own fundamental beliefs. And I think it's very unsettling for most people to find out that the way they understand the world and have lived their entire lives at whatever point they're at is open to some questions about, are there other ways of living? Are there other ways of valuing the environment? Are there other ways about decision-making process and authority? And the minute we do that, I think it's a very mentally and maybe sometimes emotionally unsettling kind of situation. So people have to come knowing that there might be some discomfort, knowing that they're going to be asked to suspend their commitment to their ways of knowing and valuing the world, and to just be patient so that all voices, all values can be shared, and then let's go from there. And I think it's also a time for some people of guilt. We see that mostly when we start talking about colonial histories, and even the belief that there's more than one version of history, and that there's many parts of history that have never been shared or taught in schools and so on. And so there's oftentimes feelings of guilt when people find out that there's other things about the history of our country, for example, that have been hidden and need to be brought out into the open and discussed. But there's also a lot of confusion. So I don't know how we get people to the table. I mean, they have to come willingly, knowing that this is going to be a time of discussion and listening. It's part of reconciliation in this country. But also to know that it may be a bit unsettling and that there's supports here for you. This is difficult for everyone, and that we will get to a better place. I think for me, there has to be a lot of hope in the process.
Yeah, I'd like to pick up on the word you mentioned, suspend, because one of the previous podcasts I did with a co-management colleague, Dr. Dennis Indolo, he talked a lot about asking people to suspend their disbelief and be willing to accept that in many situations, the Indigenous ways of knowing and how to handle a particular situation would be the most appropriate way. And you just used the word suspend too. And I'm just curious about that. Like, so when we talk about decolonizing our minds or being respectful of other worldviews, are we talking about doing that temporarily while we're in a particular situation? Or is it more of an ongoing process or way of being, so to speak?
Well, I think decolonizing our minds is very much about transformational change. So there'd be a point at which we don't need to suspend because we've gotten to another place in our thinking. So I don't think it's something that we're asking people to do for the rest of their lives. But there's a lot of discussion about how do you bring worldviews together. So we hear someone like Elder Albert Marshall talk about the guiding principles of two-eyed seeing and the respect that there's value and importance in Eurocentric Western worldviews and in Indigenous worldviews. But there's other ways of seeing it. We talk about braiding it together, and Robin Wall Kimmerer talks a lot about that in her book, Braiding Sweetgrass. But there's also the idea of the confluence of two rivers. And so Leroy Little Bear and Willie Ermine are two Indigenous scholars who talk about bringing worldviews together and that idea of confluence. So when we talk about suspending, to me, the way that I imagine it or visualize it in my mind is that in our Western society, particularly in the school system, which is just a foundational place where we prepare youth for adulthood. So they come from or graduate from high schools having had these experiences, that we very much teach people to listen so they can respond. We want children answering and being able to say something. And I think that when we come into, I don't know about co-management spaces, that's not my area of expertise, but in the spaces where I do work, we want people to come in and suspend their beliefs that they're right, or they have the answers, or that they know more than someone else, and come in and be prepared to listen. And so when we're talking about bringing worldviews together and bringing people together to have discussions, and they represent different cultures, different ways of understanding the world, then we want some suspense and we want respectful listening, not arriving thinking that you have the answer and that you know how this should work and what's right. Those kind of ideas about absolute truths are really devastating, I think, in spaces where we're trying to reconcile and decolonize.
Oh, that's a really great explanation. I really thank you for that. And I guess with all your experiences then working with so many different people and regions and situations, like what are some of the challenges you've witnessed when you see people who have accepted they're going to try to decolonize their mind or understand different worldviews, and they're very open to suspending, but it doesn't necessarily get easier after that, I know. So I'm just wondering what some of the challenges you've experienced or witnessed in people that are coming in a good way and then find that it's not as easy as they thought it might be.
It's definitely not easy. I think it's just important to say that. It's like going to the dentist and someone says, this is going to hurt. Okay, I'm glad you told me up front. So I think that people may come into those spaces with good intentions, with their heart in the right place. They want to do the right thing by standards of society, particularly since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which seemed to make some people a lot more aware of the history of Canada. And I think that we oftentimes see people arrive into spaces with good intentions and their heart in the right place, but it can be challenging situations. And as I mentioned before, people might struggle with disbelief. They might struggle with not being able to give the right answer, because this isn't about the right answer. Decolonizing our minds isn't about the right answer. It's about a process of bringing peoples together that understand the worlds in different ways, and not just saying that we will respect one another, but actually finding ways that different value systems can come together and exist in the same spaces in this country. So Willie Ermine talks about the cutting edge of knowledge production that enshrines the potential of all peoples and worldviews. I know that's a bit of a mouthful, the cutting edge of knowledge production, but he has so much wisdom, and he talks about we need to be doing things in new ways. So it isn't about whether this knowledge or this worldview is the right one or whether another one is, but rather this is where we are at this point in time. So if we're looking at the health of the ocean, or whether or not we should create a new mine somewhere, how we're going to do those kind of things as a society, then how do we bring together the values and the governance systems, the decision-making systems, so that as we move forward, we're doing so in a good way, so that the potential of all people is respected, and that we're looking out for everyone's best interest.
Yeah, that really fits nicely with his metaphor of the confluence of two rivers as well. And certainly there's new ways when those rivers converge. I know when we talked a little bit in preparation for this, I was really enjoying the way you were describing as well the confluence of the two rivers and where things get really muddy. Mm-hmm. Maybe you could share that with listeners and explain how that gets fun.
Sure. Well, if there are two strong rivers coming together, then where they first meet, there's usually a lot of the muddying of the waters, and things get riled up, the sediment on the bottom and so on. And I think that's so true for some of the discussions we're having in this country right now, that it brings things to the surface and creates a lot of muddied waters. But as we work through that and those two strong rivers continue to flow, then there is a sorting out of the currents and the waterways, and we have maybe what can be a new river that's been brought together through the joining of the two. We don't want one or the other to get lost. I mean, that's what happened in colonization, was that Indigenous peoples' lifestyles and ways of living and governing themselves and their place in the land was their languages. Everything was completely destroyed as they were assimilated into mainstream. And we certainly don't want a metaphor of the confluence of the rivers where that would happen, but rather where the water flows clearly and the strong currents from each of the two rivers continues to flow through the new waterway.
We have gotten a lot of feedback on the Co-Management Commons podcast, and one thing that we often hear is people wanting to have practical ideas on how to go forward after listening to some of these talks. So we have created a community of practice, and we invite you to check it out at www.comanagement.ca. And if you're interested in joining with other co-management allies in Canada that are meeting on a monthly basis, learning from expert guest speakers, and engaging in an online community, please check it out, and we would like to hear from you and would invite you to join us in this practical community of practice. Take care. One of the things I know many of the listeners that have been in touch regarding this podcast tend to be already bought into the idea, I think, of doing things in a new way and doing things better. But at the same time, it may be deeply embedded in a colonial structure, whether that's a university system or a government bureaucracy. And it's easier said than done to change all of that overnight when you're an individual. And most times people are looking for practical advice on what we can do at the individual levels. And I'm just wondering what we could share with people through this podcast when you do want to bring different worldviews together in a respectful way. Is there some practical, tangible advice that you would give on where to start? For some more, they may have already started down that pathway and looking for ways to push it further. Does that bring up some advice from you?
Well, first of all, it seems like a huge question. I'm sorry. One of those.
We're expecting a very succinct answer here now.
Yes. Let's solve the world's problems in 2 sentences. I'm just kidding, but I think we always have to start with ourselves. We can't change other people until we change ourselves. And so that means unpacking our own values, learning more about history, scrutinizing our own thinking and what we take for granted. I think that's a start. Being willing to be kind and patient with people who aren't in the same place that we are in terms of our thinking. It's very tiring to work in structures that haven't done much around, or institutions that haven't done much around beginning the process of change, whether we call that reconciliation or decolonizing our institutions, however we choose to put labels on that. But it's all part of the need for change. And if we're in an institution where that isn't happening or is painfully slow, then that's very tiring because we end up doing a lot of teaching and it's wearing on the patience that we might have. But I do think that those are important things. And also being willing to stand up and share what we know. And so, for example, these podcasts that you're doing or any courses, workshops that we're able to offer. So teaching people, sharing experiences with other ones, I think is important. That idea of sharing what we know and what we've experienced and what our struggles are, I think is important for all of us as we enter into this process of trying to transform our society and our culture into something that's decolonized.
Congratulations as well, by the way, on your book, Trickster Chases the Tale of Education. And I know in reading the book, there was a lot of referencing to our default thinking skills. And I guess it's our default where we're going to go on a day-to-day basis. It's probably very efficient to go with the default, but is there a way, I guess, to break out of those defaults? Like, that's not it's not a trip that happens. So I'm just wondering, what's your advice there? Like, how do we even identify what those defaults are is something I'm curious about now, what my own defaults probably are, and I don't even realize it.
Sure. Well, we all have them. Those are our cognitive structures of, it's like scaffolding in our mind. And that's where we fasten on all the things we learn and all the ways we have of being in the world is through those cognitive structures. So to me, default thinking skills are the well-worn paths through our neurological network of just what it is, because that's how we do things. And we've never maybe stopped to question ourselves or realized what the foundation is of a particular habit or way of being in the world that we might have. So one of the ways I think about it, and this might work for people who live in more rural areas, is that in the springtime, a pathway through the woods, or what we call a woods road, will get very muddy and the ruts will become worn as people go over it with, whether it's a four-wheeler or an off-road vehicle or something, and those ruts get very, very deep. And what I think of is trying to stay up out of those ruts. I grew up in a rural place where we had roads like that. So that's how I learned to drive when I was 16. Stay up out of the ruts, because otherwise you'll hit the bottom of the car or whatever vehicle you're driving. But to stay up out of them is very, very difficult because the vehicle tends to go back down into the ruts. It's hard to hold the steering wheel and keep the vehicle out of those well-worn pathways. And what I think of is how we have to do that every day, to always be conscious of it, that sometimes we slip back into those habits of thinking. I think of them as habits of our mind, and that it takes concerted effort over a period of time to break ourselves of those kind of mental habits, if those are the things that we want to break ourselves of.
You just brought me back to the early days of the Trans-Labrador Highway and how bad those ruts really were.
Yes.
And I've spent a lot of time in those. I'm also curious for us to unpack a little bit about the trickster and this worldview. He obviously shows up in your book title, and I see it referred to often in other Indigenous contexts. And just wondering if you could explain for people, what is the trickster, or who is the trickster, and what's the meaning behind the trickster?
Mm-hmm. So the trickster is a figure in many stories, oral stories, and literature or art forms across many cultures. It's worldwide, this figure, but it might be represented by different creatures. So it could be represented by a coyote, a crow, a clown, jokester, different creatures. And the trickster really represents that time of confusion, maybe questioning things, being inappropriate, but making everyone sort of stop and listen. The trickster might be making jokes about things and brings a lot of confusion. So to me, the trickster represents that space where that's been turned topsy-turvy. The routine way of doing things is brought into question, and it just becomes kind of chaotic. And that's exactly how I feel and have felt for many years as I've worked in these places of decolonizing, worked in education, tried to bring about change, is that it's a place and a time when there aren't easy answers, where the rules that we've lived by are no longer fitting, and it's a time of change. And that's very unsettling for most of us because it's not easy. But there will be a new time coming.
So the trickster, they're not necessarily a bad thing at all.
No, they might be annoying, as I wrote about in my book. So my book premised on me being the naive researcher, not really knowing what I was doing, and a crow who becomes the central figure, questioning everything I'm doing, making fun of me, making jokes about it, belittling me, but really drawing attention to what some of the challenges are, particularly in research, the way we might be trained as researchers, and the things that need to happen for us to change how we approach research. So that was the premise of the book. And the trickster isn't only the character that brings this confusion and chaos, but is also the character that brings the wisdom. And so in the joking around, there's wise points, and you go, oh, yes, why didn't I think of that? Yeah, really makes you think.
So when you were writing the book then, was the trickster your way of self-reflecting on the research processes and things that you were going through? Like, because you were articulating and narrating the trickster. So was it a reflective practice that you did in that sense? Or did it sort of border on parts of fiction and nonfiction with your actual research experience that you were having?
Well, whether I was narrating the trickster or if the trickster, the crow, was narrating the book through me, I suppose we could question what that process was. It was very much about a reflective process and realizing the paradoxes, the barriers that I was coming up against as I was trying to do the research that I was doing, trying to find a good way of doing it, knowing that so much has to change and that it's not easy. You can't just walk into a place and change everything. That changes, and it's the good thing about it is that it's the small steps that are happening as we develop relationships and have that kind of respectful relationships and reciprocity with other people, and give people time to work through the mental kind of questioning of themselves and their experiences in the world. So I think that the book was just a reflection of all of that happening in my head at the same time. And it just got characterized by this researcher and a trickster character as well, having a conversation back and forth. So when people read that, they see, oh, yes, it's this, and yes, I can see that. And it's a way of people realizing that there are those contradictions there. There is no right way, and there may not necessarily be an easy way. It's a process of change.
No, I think it's sinking in for me now. I really appreciate you unpacking that for me. And probably because of my own habits or whatnot, when I hear trickster, I often associated it with, well, maybe it's a bad thing or whatnot, but it's really a lot more nuanced than that, obviously.
I think the book is a really good example of how you might reach people of different mindsets. So for some of the researchers or students who've read that book who hold or are very enmeshed in a Western worldview and a very strict idea about how you do research, they would read it and they would see and understand some of the points that were brought up through this narration and this bantering back and forth. For the First Nations community that I worked with, they read it and made comments around how hilarious it was that this crow is giving a researcher such a hard time. So I think that speaks to the many facets that come up in these situations, and how can we create environments where all people can learn and sit back and go, oh, now that's something for me to think about. Yeah, that's important.
So I know in a few short weeks, you're going to have a captive audience of people working mostly in the government sector, and they're very interested in this topic and want to take some practical steps forward. And just wondering how you're going to go about approaching those dialogues. And are you going to play the trickster in those sessions, or?
I could, but I think it will be useful to be a combination of some teaching, some ideas that I can share around this is normal. This is what happens to us. It can be confusing. It can be irritating and frustrating and very tiring for a person to think through some of these things. So that kind of, what can we expect as we go through this process? But I think the other part is also to lay out some suggestions about how people might begin the process of unpacking their own thinking frameworks. And, how do you approach that? What is it that I can do after I leave this session today and I'll come back for the next session? What can I do in the meantime? So to make some suggestions around that. And then the third thing would just to be to facilitate a conversation and listen to some of the questions that people have. I mean, they're entering this new kind of space. They're coming with good intentions in their heart and wanting to change or to learn and grow and to know more. So what are some questions that they're coming with, and how can those be answered either within the group or through me sharing some of my experiences?
One of the things that we do talk a lot about is our positionality as researchers. And I know when I first tried to write my first positionality statement, I thought it was very hard and I just wasn't getting it right. And I wasn't challenging myself either, I don't believe, as much as I needed to do. And I'm curious to talk about that a little bit briefly, because a lot of times when I hear people share their positionality, it can sometimes be on a very high level. Some people are willing to share some more personal things sometimes about who they are and what's brought them to the space that they're in. But what I often feel like I think is missing a little bit is how that positionality can have a direct influence sometimes on the work that we're doing. And I'm just wondering if you could help me connect those dots. But after having this conversation with you, it makes me feel like maybe the positionality that we bring to a space is perhaps in that gray area of being in the ruts or having a default, and we're bringing all of that to a situation and not really realizing how we're probably influencing a discussion or actions that are about to happen. Does that resonate for you too, or?
Yeah, it completely resonates, because I think that's how our minds are trained. That's how we're considered to be experts, is that we have a lot of knowledge in a particular area, whether it's management skills or a particular area such as education, teaching, whatever it is, that we're very knowledgeable, but we can go into a situation and work. We're highly qualified because we have a lot of knowledge in a particular area, and we have well-worn paths through our thinking. And that's really wonderful. If I have a heart condition, I want to know that the heart surgeon is really well trained and knows what he or she is doing when they're operating on my heart. At the same time, I think that part of what you brought up with that question is around regarding positionality is our identity, and not just who we know ourselves to be, but what our family and our community and maybe our profession has told us about who we are and whether or not we belong in it, or to whichever group we belong in whatever way. So I speak English, so I do really well in English settings, but am I going to fit in as well in, Italy or Germany? If I moved there, how long would it take before I was considered a local person if I never learned any of the language, right? So you don't speak any German. So, how long have you been here, kind of thing? Do you know what I mean? Like, what is it that when we talk about positionality, how are we saying who we are, who we know ourselves to be, and how much of that is also influenced by what we understand to mean belonging to a particular group or a particular place in society? So if I say I'm a university professor, then what is it I'm saying? What do I understand that to mean? And what does someone else understand when I say that? Have I taken you off in the wrong direction?
No, not at all. It just makes me think deeply, like I knew you were going to do at the beginning of all of this. And my wife jokes with me that she says that she's never seen a problem that I couldn't make worse. And I'm thinking that the fact that I can see that now, that I am creating a problem here, shows that maybe I am improving and getting better. And because I never would have saw that years ago, frankly, I would have just debated it. So I'll take that as progress on my part.
Okay. So if people came into a session, or for the one that we're going to have in a few weeks, if they tell me what their positionality is, that's great. But my job will then be to dig and ask what that really means. What does that mean to them? And what does that mean in terms of how they live their lives, how they understand what it means for them to have a good life, and where they learned that from.
So we're coming up on our time together today, and I guess just after everything we've discussed, does it bring up any concluding thoughts or points that you would like to make or end off on, and have the final word on worldviews, decolonizing our minds, positionality?
Just that I appreciate being in this conversation with you, and that you'll be sharing this out with other people, and hopefully that there will be something in this session that will make people think and be helpful to them in some way. All of us have different things that we might connect with, so just hopefully your audience different people will find at least something in here that's of value to them.
I definitely think they will. It's certainly a lot about relationships when it comes to co-management and trying to navigate different systems and worldviews. And sometimes there's more than two rivers that all converge into one spot. And there is a lot of muddiness at times, and there's definitely a lot of work to do. So to me, I think all of this resonates very clearly with the discussions that we're having in the co-management field. So I'm certainly grateful that you took the time to think this through with me and share your experience and knowledge. And I look forward to seeing you soon. It's always a pleasure working with you and taking the time to learn from you. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Jamie. I appreciate it.
All right, take care. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Co-Management Commons podcast, supported by Cloudberry Connections. Each episode is engineered by Spencer Thompson, and we strive to keep making each episode better and more entertaining. But at the heart of this podcast, we really value the quality of our guests and all the expertise, knowledge that they have been willing to share. Please also visit comanagement.ca, where we continue to compile as many open access resources as possible about co-management in Canada. And until the next time we're together, please stay safe in peace and friendship. And remember that we are all treaty people in Canada, and we can all have an impact in reconciliation. Take care.